Hello and welcome to Bristol Ideas. I'm Andrew Kelly. I'm joined today by Tania Branigan. Tania spent 7 years in Beijing as The Guardian's China correspondent. Her first book is Red Memory, Living, Remembering and Forgetting China's Cultural Revolution. Tania, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Tania, you spent 7 years in China when you were able to research key parts of this book. It was hard then to get information and talk to people. But if you were starting now, you wouldn't be able to write this book at all, would you?
No, absolutely. What was really striking about that time was that people were beginning to come forward to talk about the Cultural Revolution in a way that they hadn't perhaps before. In particular, while there was a sort of an outburst of writing in the immediate aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, that had really been closed off by authorities. And also that was more usually about the things that people had done to them, if I can put it that way. What was striking in that time around sort of 2010 and a little bit later was that people were choosing to come forward and talk about the things that they had done, to take responsibility, to apologize sometimes. And that felt quite different. And I think it was partly because there was a period where, while there was clearly a lot of censorship in China, there was less censorship than there is today. With social media and with civil society, people had sort of clawed out this space where it was possible to talk about some of the more difficult aspects of the past. And that has really changed. And it's partly because there's been a real political tightening within China, particularly since Xi Jinping took over, although it wasn't initiated by him. I would say it began before him, but also a real concern, particularly under Xi, about discussion of the past. And Xi Jinping has talked about this idea of historical nihilism, the idea that it's a sort of existential threat to the party. So history itself has become a real sort of battleground.
So you mentioned there about the material that came out soon after the Cultural Revolution. This was the scar literature, as it's called. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So there was this sort of immediate outburst, perhaps unsurprisingly, in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, as people wrote about these harrowing experiences that they had been through. It was tolerated for a while. I think it was quite useful to the authorities because it helped to explain why they weren't following the path of Maoism that everybody had been told to follow for so long. They were going to turn towards the market and greater individualism. And so it justified what was coming. I think it also was cathartic in a sense that people had an opportunity to talk about what had happened. But it was always clear that it wouldn't be sort of tolerated forever, I think, and quite quickly authorities sort of moved to shut that down. They didn't want people dwelling on it for too long.
One of our key areas of work in Bristol is working through the past, coming to terms with the past to understand where we are now and which might perhaps help create a better future. And this is the same with your work on China, I think, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, as I say in the book, no country is honest about its past. And we see the kind of difficulties that people face in confronting the past, the difficulties of being honest about it, how challenging it can be to people, even if we're talking about events of perhaps 200-300 years ago. So to deal with something much more recent and within living memory is always going to be difficult. Now, obviously, there are profound differences when you're talking about somewhere where the state has such control over discussions, over discourse, not only over what is taught in schools and what is taught in universities, but even what is published, what is discussed openly. And so in China, it's been much more fraught. But the thing that really perhaps pushed me to write the book was the realization that the silence that surrounds the Cultural Revolution wasn't just about political repression, but was also very much about the personal traumas that people had been through. It was about the fact that society very often didn't want to talk about it. And the people in Red Memory are unusual because they're the people who did choose to remember, or perhaps not even chose, who felt in some way compelled to, forced to confront the past. And so it's very important, I think, that we assess, that we see those parallels. And that we understand it's not just about whether people remember the past, but how they remember the past. And those discussions can be really fraught. And that was perhaps the thing that surprised me most, not just that there are people who are intensely nostalgic about the Cultural Revolution in a way that we might find challenging or peculiar or odd, but also that even people who think, well, this was a terrible time and we mustn't go back through it again, still have very, very different ideas about what exactly happened, about how it should be remembered, about how much responsibility different people should take for it.
I'm going to come back to that. Let's just talk about the Cultural Revolution itself. I mean, how long did it last, the Cultural Revolution?
It was 10 years. So Mao unleashed it in 1966, and it ended only after his death. And in fact, even in his last few months, he said it was something that wasn't finished and would still have to be concluded. So he saw it very much as a work in progress. Initially, if we think about the part that people think about usually as the Cultural Revolution, which is this upsurge of sort of political vigilanteism with the Red Guards attacking people, and then after a while turning upon each other and becoming very factionalized, that really sort of lasted 2 or 3 years. And Mao had originally thought about it as quite a sort of short movement. But then after that, you had a period which was more stagnant, more bureaucratic, but still incredibly politically doctrinaire, very volatile because different factions would sort of come in and out of power or influence. And also just as deadly or even more so, huge numbers died in the later stages as well.
Now, reading the book and reading about the Cultural Revolution, the aim was to attack what were called 5 black categories: landlords, rich farmers, counter-revolutionaries, bad elements and rightists, but also attacking old things, old ideas, old culture, old customs and old habits. So it was a mixture of that, but also it was about Mao's control of the party, wasn't it?
Absolutely. So Mao had enjoyed political supremacy for a long time within the party, but in the late 1950s, he launched the Great Leap Forward, which was this hubristic, frankly, sort of insane attempt to collectivize agriculture, revolutionize industry, overtake the UK in industrial output. But fundamentally, really, he was interested in sort of seizing the banner of international communism and showing that China was sort of at the front. Of course, it was an absolute disaster, and tens of millions of people died in the famine that resulted. And in the end, it had to be reined back by more pragmatic figures within the party. He grudged that immensely, and he also grudged the loss of authority that he had experienced. And so, yes, the Cultural Revolution was really at its heart an attempt to overthrow all political opposition, to eradicate all political opposition and reassert himself. But what complicates that is the fact that, unlike previous purges within the party, he goes outside the party structures, he turns to the masses. And so it becomes this mass movement using very young people, often children in many cases, people in their early teens. And because it does that, it then draws in all these other factors. So it was for him a genuinely ideological movement, as well, as you say, that he really felt the party had been perhaps seduced by power, that it was insufficiently communist, it hadn't really carried the revolution through, he wanted it to be more pure. But because he brings all these other people in, then you've got this political zealotry, and of course you have all the other factors that you would expect when you have a mass movement, which is people's ambition, people's personal grudges against each other. And so it becomes this extraordinary force that just convulses the whole country, from the top leaders in Beijing right through to sort of farmers in the most remote provinces. Everybody is touched by it.
And it's enormous, isn't it, as you say? I mean, the Rustication Program, where, was it 17 million people went to rural areas, 60% of urban youth, and huge.
Yes, I mean, they were sent down there. They thought they were going for life. They thought they would probably never return. They were told they were going there to set down roots. And it's very hard for us to imagine, I think, what it must have been like for those city kids, because they were not just going such a long way from their parents, perhaps hundreds, even thousands of miles away from their families, but they were also really going back a century in terms of living conditions. You know, there were people who had, at least prior to the Cultural Revolution, they'd been in school, they'd been living these very orderly lives. poor by our standards in the West, obviously, and by the standards of modern China. But suddenly they were going to places which had no running water, perhaps, where they were having to go to wells to draw their water. They were going to places without electricity, places they might not even be able to reach by road, no facilities to live these grueling, very basic lives where they were struggling to make a living because, of course, they weren't used to farming. And suddenly here they were expected to scratch a living. So many of them were quite idealistic when they first went off. They were told that they were going there to kind of drag the countryside into modernity, but also very critically to learn from peasants to become politically better and sort of purer and more communist. And they realized very quickly that was just not realizable. And those dreams turned sour pretty fast.
And in addition to that was the brutality of it. Millions again died in this, didn't they? Even though we can't quite tell how many.
Well, we know around 2 million people probably died in the Cultural Revolution. Many people were killed, beaten to death, executed in the later stages, often for political crimes, but also often hounded to suicide. Some of China's most famous figures, such as Lao She, who's one of the greatest writers, he ended up drowning himself after he'd been hounded by Red Guards. And then there were tens of millions of people persecuted who saw their lives destroyed in other ways. Even if they survived the Cultural Revolution, they really would never be the same again. And I think one of the most potent aspects was really the fact that it touched you at such a sort of personal level, that it was often the people who were closest to you, who were the most dangerous to you, who were the ones who might turn on you. So we saw workmates turning on workmates. We saw parents and children being divided, children denouncing their parents. It was a time of extraordinary betrayals and a time really of impossible moral choices where people were forced into making these very painful decisions about their own survival, about the survival of their families. Incredibly traumatic.
And you tell some of those stories in the book. You were fortunately able to talk to some people who could give these stories to you, and one of them was the one that jumped out at me was Zhong, who showed how his family was torn apart. He informed on his mother, I think.
That's right, yes. So the family had been through a pretty traumatic time in the Cultural Revolution already by this stage. He lost his sister very early on. She was one of the Red Guards who went up to Beijing to see Mao. And there was a big meningitis outbreak, which was basically spread by all the young people traveling around the country. And so she caught meningitis, she died. Her parents really felt the Cultural Revolution was responsible, I think. And then his father was persecuted. His mother was subsequently persecuted. And so when she was finally allowed out, perhaps unsurprisingly, she was very bitter about the experience. And whether she had simply broken down or whether she was just simply so angry she couldn't contain it, she attacked, denounced Mao, tried to burn his portrait and so forth. And Zhang Hongbing and his father went to the authorities and informed her, knowing that that would lead to her death, as it did. She was executed shortly afterwards.
Now, one of the stories which kind of bookends the book is Song Bin Bin, who is the student who took part in an attack on the teacher and then apologized later on. Tell us Song Bin Bin's story. She
was involved in what's now become a very notorious case. Bian Zhongyun was perhaps the first victim in Beijing to die in the Cultural Revolution, we believe. She was a teacher, a vice principal at a rather prestigious girls' school, which had the daughters of many senior leaders. And when the Cultural Revolution broke out and people began to publish what were called these big character posters, which were basically denunciations of leaderships in various institutions, one of the first very early ones was at her school. Song Bin Bin and a couple of her friends put up a poster which criticised the school's leadership. And obviously that included Bian Zhongyun, who was then vice principal. That began a phase of the hounding of Bian Zhongyun, struggle sessions, as they were called, these very vicious denunciation sessions, people being forced to labour and then being sort of beaten, and that led to Bien Jong-un's death. Now, Song Bin herself was not one of the people who beat Bien Jong-un on the day of her death, but many people wrongly assumed that she was, and certainly held her responsible. One of the reasons for that is because just a few days later, she was one of the Red Guards who went to a mass rally, the first mass rally that Chairman Mao held for the youths in Tiananmen Square. And she, because of her connections, her father was quite an influential figure, was able to climb up and present Mao with a red armband, which showed that he was giving his sort of seal of approval, essentially, to the Red Guards. And this was a critical moment. This is the moment at which the young people are sort of told to go out, destroy the olds, as you say, and also they now feel they have Mao's seal of approval. And Mao says to her, "What's your name?" And she says, "Song Bin," and he says, as in refined or gentle. And she says, "Yes." And he says, "Well, be martial." And so in the days that follow, she then appears all over the newspapers, all over the propaganda, supposedly having changed her name to Be Marshall. She becomes this figurehead. And because of that, she is even more associated with the killing of Bien Jong-un. And she becomes really, she's first feted initially, as I said, in propaganda, but over the years, she also becomes in many ways the scapegoat. She comes to symbolize this. And in 2012, she came forward to actually apologize, to say that she wishes she'd done more to stop the beatings on that fatal day. An apology that Bien Jong-un's widower didn't want to accept. He felt was insincere, an apology that was quickly criticized, attacked by many people. And it really seemed to me that it came to epitomize so many of the arguments, just as her case had once epitomized the violence and the hatred of the Cultural Revolution that people saw. So it later came to epitomize the arguments over responsibility and forgiveness. These questions, how responsible would any 15 or 16-year-old be for what happened in that era, in a political framework where they'd all been very clearly indoctrinated in an ideal of struggle and were urged to go out and sort of turn upon older figures. Questions about why people are criticized for coming forward when we know that there are many people who murdered people in what became known as Red August and were never held responsible in any forum and have never held up their hands to say that they were involved in any way. So supporters say, well, hang on a sec, she came forward and yet you're still saying that's not good enough, it's not sincere enough, you're turning upon her. But she's somebody who actually at least has come forward for whatever reason to talk about it. And there are many, many more people, of course, who haven't.
Now, the widower of the teacher did create a kind of shrine, didn't he, and preserved some of the belongings of and also hid her ashes behind walls. I found that incredibly moving, and also an attempt to memorialize in a time when memorialization is very difficult.
It is so striking to me that people knew how important it would be to remember. I mean, it's very striking in terms of its devotion. As I said, people did turn upon their spouses, for example. People often divorced, denounced their spouses. So it's striking how many people did continue to be loyal under intense pressure often. And that's a really important thing to remember, I think. But it's also really striking that instinct to remember, to believe that justice would be done, but also to believe that these things had to be memorialized, recorded, remembered in some way, so that at some point in future, people would be able to talk about them, there was the idea put forward by a scholar in the aftermath of a Cultural Revolution museum and so on. But even at the time, as another great example, there's a wonderful book called Red Colour News Soldier, by a man who was a photographer for an official newspaper at the time, but also took thousands of images of struggle sessions and so forth, which he knew would never be published, and hid them for many years. Because again, he thought there had to be a record, that these things had to be remembered. And so people took great risks at a time when you just did not want to associate yourselves with people who've been sort of named and shamed or denounced in some way. You know, many people distanced themselves, but others really did choose to remember and to be loyal.
Now, some of the people who were who suffered in this actually went on to lead China, didn't they? Xi is one of them.
Yes, I mean, this is so striking. His family went through very difficult times. His father was a sort of revered revolutionary, but was already in political trouble by the time the Cultural Revolution began. And of course, that then intensified. So he was denounced. Xi himself, we understand, was denounced at times. Reportedly, his own mother had to denounce him at a rally. His elder sister half-sister ended up killing herself, we believe, because the family had been under such pressure for so many years. And then he was one of these 17 million teenagers who was sent down to the countryside and spent about 7 years in pretty grim rural circumstances. What's so striking about this, I think, is twofold. One thing is the fact that when his father and others were rehabilitated after the Cultural Revolution, they spent a long time trying to sort of cage and collectivize power because they didn't want to have a strongman again. And Xi, in his tenure, has sort of torn down many of those safeguards, like term limits, for example, and is now the most powerful leader since Mao. But the second thing that's sort of striking is that these rather miserable years in the countryside have been turned into the one part of the Cultural Revolution that's not just remembered in official discourse, but even celebrated. It's become a sort of creation myth that sort of testifies to his understanding of the people, shows that he knows how hard it is to be an ordinary person, that he's been at the bottom, that he's struggled. And of course, all of that is true. I mean, he has had an experience of what it's like to sort of go through life in rural China, this sort of very grim, grueling experience of life that few other leaders could manage.
Yeah, I thought it was one of the most remarkable things I read in this brilliant book. Moving on to trauma. This is about national trauma and it's about individual trauma, isn't it? And you mentioned the Great Leap Forward as happening just a few years before the Cultural Revolution, but that was also part of ongoing traumas, isn't it? Taiping Rebellion, you talk about Japanese invasion, warlordism, you call it fresh rubble piled itself upon the rubble.
Chinese sort of modern history is just a history of a series of traumas. So we have clearly those wrought by other countries, including Britain, and other nations as they sort of sought to carve up or carve off parts of China over the years, and particularly, of course, the very brutal Japanese invasion during the war. We saw just this host of traumas, as I say, and then the Great Leap Forward, in which around 40 million people died, we believe. And so the Cultural Revolution was hugely traumatic, but in many ways it was the culmination. It wasn't coming out of the blue. And in fact, even the aftermath, I think, when China then turned to a more sort of individualistic, more personal freedom sort of model where you had the market and so forth, that in itself was another trauma, because people who had been through the Cultural Revolution thought, my God, we went through all of that and we believed it was for something. And now we're being told that it was all just a bit of a mistake and shouldn't really have happened. And so I think that in itself was very hard for people to understand, to process, to come to terms with. And then I think the fact that there was this inability to address what had happened in the Cultural Revolution in any depth. As I said, there was a very sort of short reckoning by authorities. There was an official verdict, but the point of it was always, Deng Xiaoping said, we've got to address this so that people can unite and move forward. It wasn't the case that this was about saying, never again, let's memorialize this. It was about saying, like, let's just draw a line under this and move on.
Is that oh, sorry, continue, yeah.
Well, just that there's never really been that reckoning. So on a personal level, many people feel unable to speak about it. It's very common, even within families where people experienced it together, that they won't talk about it to each other. Certainly with the younger generations, so many people have said to me that something happened to their parents or grandparents, but they just won't speak about it at all. They don't know what it was. It's this sort of mystery at the heart of the family almost. But then on a social level as well, because it's been written about very powerfully, as a sinologist said, this was a social trauma, a collective trauma. And so at some stage, you have to have a collective understanding of it. It's not enough for individuals to try and work it through. There has to be some sort of attempt to address this. And of course, that's something that the Communist Party has felt it's impossible to do, because it attacks its own sort of roots of power, really. It undercuts itself.
Does the Chinese government, China itself, look back on the Great Leap Forward in a similar way? Is that something that's not talked about?
It's usually referred to as the 3 years of natural difficulties. So it's not accepted that this was something that was wrought by Mao. There's a very striking exhibition at the museum of the big sort of Chinese National Museum, which interestingly Xi Jinping visited as soon as he came to power. Almost the first thing he does, certainly his first public act, is to take his colleagues down to this exhibition, because it tells the story of how the Communist Party saved China from the turmoil. It saved them from these years of disaster and humiliation and trauma that we've talked about, sort of united them and led them forward into the future. And there is one very small room that has the title something like Some Setbacks and Difficulties, on the road to communism, in which you'll see a few documents relating to the Great Leap Forward and how it had to be sort of reined in by the authorities. But unless you already know the context and you know what that's about, you wouldn't be able to take that from reading any of the captions or looking at the exhibits. It's a sort of a series of notes that was taken by one of the figures in the party who sort of reined it back when he went to the countryside and saw how terrible it was. But unless you already know all that context and history, you couldn't identify it. So it's not something that the party chooses to talk about. I mean, the party, even before Xi, has always seen history as being quite central to its authority, partly through this narrative of we've saved you, and this sense that you have to make people not only look forward to this utopian vision of a wonderful communist society that lies in the future, or currently this vision of sort of a greater, prouder, more assertive nation state, but that you also contrast that with what's gone before. So even in the early years of power, they have these rituals of what they call remembering past bitterness and contrasting it with a current happiness. It's all about looking back and saying that was terrible. Look how much better our future is. So they can't afford to dwell on the things that they got wrong. And also, I think, because if you give people the opportunity to judge the past, you're really according them the right to judge the future, or to judge the present and to judge the future under you.
I mean, this is something which, again, Bristol has struggled with sometimes, particularly its history of trading in enslaved people, and coming to some collective understanding has been essential, and that's still underway. It's like the Germans call, working through the past, looking at, the relationship with Nazism and the Holocaust and how you come to terms with that. When it comes to trauma, you have the immediate, issues of people directly involved, and some of them were able to write things about this. But then you have the kind of transgenerational trauma as well. And this comes through the generations, doesn't it?
Yes, and that was one of the things that was so striking to me, the realization that not only were so many people profoundly traumatized still by what they had experienced and what they had witnessed in the 60s, but that these forces play out through the generations, even or perhaps especially when people don't speak about it. And so, as I write in the book, I mean, the understanding of transgenerational trauma is really something that began with the children of Holocaust survivors. It became very clear that they were more likely to suffer from PTSD after stressful events, for example, that they had higher rates of mental health problems. And those have even been seen carrying through into a third generation. And so it was extraordinary talking to people, both individuals about their family stories, I suppose, but also talking to psychotherapists about the people they were treating. And this realization that people were still being affected by these things now. I mean, the story I think that really struck me was this story of a student at university who'd seemed very capable, very willing, hardworking, likable boy. And suddenly he writes this very graphic account of how he wants to kill one of his tutors, which causes the university authorities to get involved. And it ends up, when he and his family see a therapist, with the emergence of the fact that, unknown to this student, his grandfather was murdered by Red Guards in front of his father. And so his father had never spoken a word about this, believing that was sort of safest and best for his family. And yet he had brought his son up saying, you know, don't ever show your feelings, don't let people see you're angry, you can't let anything out, you've always got to be defensive, you've got to sort of build this wall, in a way that has obviously profoundly damaged his child. And it's a sort of heartbreaking thing, I suppose, that there's something hopeful in there, perhaps, in that you have this man who is capable of this immense love for his child, despite everything he's been through. And yet he doesn't know how to help his son. And so I was struck by the immense trauma and by the very damaging effects it's had on so many families and so many relationships, and perhaps on social fabric itself within China. But I think there is also a degree of hope. It was incredible to me to think about the experiences that people had been through and find that nonetheless they still had a passion for life. You know, I talk about the composer who was almost murdered in the Cultural Revolution. But he has this immense passion for life, perhaps more than almost anybody I've ever met. You have these people who've been through very traumatic, scarring experiences, and yet they deeply love their children and want to protect and help them. And so life has gone on in some ways. People have found a way to live with it, but it is there just under the surface, and it is still very damaging.
You mentioned psychotherapists, and for a long time, psychotherapy was not something to pursue in China, was it?
No, I mean, interestingly, sort of back in Freud's time, there was certainly one Chinese scholar who corresponded with him and I think translated some of his work. But then for many times, psychotherapy and psychology itself actually was really off the agenda. It was a sort of bourgeois pseudoscience. It wasn't tolerated. And it took a long time to have this sort of revival of interest. So there's a very medicalized model, I suppose, of mental health and mental illness. But even when psychotherapy did begin to reemerge, I mean, there's been this great fascination. I think part of that yearning for identity, self-expression that follows the Cultural Revolution and the sort of the rapacious grasp of the rapacious sort of capitalism which followed. You've had this search for meaning and for identity more recently in those years, and this great interest in psychotherapy, but it's still been something that's very difficult for a lot of people, and precisely because the Cultural Revolution taught people that speech was difficult, speech was troubling, speech was something that got you into danger. So the idea that you would open your mouth and speak about it seems very difficult. And you would think in some ways that psychotherapy might be rather a sort of neat solution, in that it takes a social problem and sort of turns it into a problem of individuals, which is solved in the treatment room rather than at a sort of political or social level. But I think just the act of speaking out, the fact that perhaps it means challenging people even within your family, all of those things make it actually rather difficult and rather contested.
I mean, you write in the book about memory and about searching for truth, and you quote a historian who told you there are people who are willing to talk, there are people who are not willing, and there are many people who are willing to talk but not to tell the truth. And you write about memory as creation, not retrieval, and that trauma in particular can shatter, distort and scramble what we remember. And that's an added problem, isn't it, in coming to terms with all of this?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that was fascinating for me was to learn more about the science of memory, I suppose, and to realize that there are so many aspects to it, that the trauma itself, as you say, has clearly distorted and shattered memories, that people lived through such a fraught and dangerous time that they obviously feel the need to protect themselves often. As I said, that's one reason that people feel unable to talk about it, that they just think the memory itself is dangerous. That it becomes clear that people still feel the need to protect themselves. And as I said, these arguments about how to remember the past do become very intense and very personal. We see a lot of ad hominem attacks. We see people unable to discuss it. It's not something that can be discussed in a cool and calm and theoretical way, because it's still too live a subject for many people. So that was really what I wanted to explore. It's not just what people remember, but how they remember and why they remember. We started off talking about whether people can be honest about the past and about nostalgia. And one of the things that sort of strikes me is when people look at the past, so much of it is about the present and about their judgments and their reading of the present and what they think about today. And so, for example, the nostalgia that we've seen in China for the era, this idea it was a time of greater equality, greater meaning, somehow greater purity, really emerged from that sense that this very rapacious capitalism had brought enormous corruption, enormous inequality, that it had all become about money. There was no sort of belief in values, and there was sort of truth in all of those ideas. And that really sort of drove people back to this sort of idealized vision of the past in a way that we clearly see in other countries too.
And I was going to say, I mean, there's a wonderful book by Vivian Gornick called The Romance of American Communism, and she interviewed old communists in America and the meaning that gave to their lives, being involved in something that often in defiance of the understanding that, the Stalinist period, particularly in the Soviet Union, but it gave them meaning. It gave them that their lives hadn't been a waste. For some of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly when people have devoted so many years of their lives and when so much of their identity is bound up in it as well, it's very difficult to turn back. But there are also aspects, in which people are right to see that there were elements of that time that seemed very beneficial. I mean, there is an argument really, which is that our view of the Cultural Revolution is coloured by the fact that most of the accounts are written by intellectuals and scholars, because those are the people who write history books, and they are precisely the people who suffered most in that era. And so the sort of rebuttal from scholars like Mobo Gao, who comes from quite a poor background, is to say, well, I remember the Cultural Revolution as being a time when we had culture for the first time in our village. People would bring plays and things. Nobody ever cared about villagers before. I remember it as a time when workers and villagers had more respect in a way that they hadn't previously. I think it's very hard to say that those things, you can't look at history in terms of sort of a list of pros and cons, obviously. It seems quite odd to set those things beside the deaths of 2 million people and the houndings of tens of millions. But it's not entirely wrong to say that there were aspects of that time that people genuinely valued, found meaning in, saw as beneficial, and they miss those.
Do you think one of the problems is lack of things like civic memorials about museums? You actually visit a museum which is dedicated to the Cultural Revolution, but it's closed. That's the only one, I think, that covers this in any way.
Yes, so I mean, this is so striking that there's really nowhere to go to talk about it. I mean, there are books that have been published in China about the Cultural Revolution, and they are still in print for the most part. But for a long time, there's really been reluctance on the part of authorities. They told publishing houses a few decades ago to sort of stop producing new histories and things of the Cultural Revolution. It's dealt with very passingly in school textbooks, for example, very briskly, and then people move on. So the Cultural Revolution actually was an idea that was quite useful for authorities, as I said, firstly in justifying the turn to the market, but also it has helped bolster the Communist Party's political grip, because the message has basically been, well, you can have us or you can have turmoil, and you all remember what the turmoil was like. And for many people in China, that has been a very powerful message. So they've wanted people to have a sort of vague idea of it, but they haven't wanted people to look at it in depth. And the result is that particularly younger people often have very little or almost no idea of what it really was. And then, as I said, the other places where you might expect people to hear about it, within families and so forth, it's just not been discussed again. So for many people, it is really just a blank now.
And that idea that you have a country that goes through all these traumas, as we talked about earlier, I can understand why there's a wish to have some kind of stability and being able to move forward without that kind of trauma. You talk about in the book how probably most people actually prefer what Chinese rule at the moment. Would you say that?
Yes, I mean, it's very hard to know, of course. It's first of all, it's hard to know what people actually think in a country where everybody knows that expression of your opinion is very tightly policed, and increasingly so, and where many people have either suffered consequences or seen other people suffer consequences for not towing the party line. But then beyond that, of course, it's even harder to know what people would think if you didn't have the extensive censorship and propaganda that is in place. Interestingly, a couple of people have said to me that they think their families have become more sort of red and more doctrinaire just over the period of COVID, for example, when there was less contact with the outside world. So it's hard to know what people's views would be if they were able to see these things freely. But it's also important to say that many people do feel that the Communist Party has served them well, and that particularly in recent years, it has rolled out a welfare state at extraordinary speed. It's very patchy, it's very threadbare in many places, embryonic, it's got a lot of work to do, but they've managed to do that at remarkable speed. We've seen roads being built across the country. We've seen this experience of prosperity that was just unimaginable to many people before. And so many people do think, well, the party's brought us stability, it's brought us wealth, and that's something that they can feel very materially. And their view is perhaps that they're less worried by other aspects. They don't really care about, even if they know what happened in 1989 with Tiananmen Square and the protesters and the massacre of pro-democracy protesters and their supporters, they don't think that in the end perhaps matters to them as much, or they think it's understandable in some ways. They've accepted that for many people. And of course, we can't know how they would feel if they lived in a society where that was discussed more freely. But it's also important to recognize that their experience does tell them something about the benefits they've seen. Now, there are many things you could question in modern China, not just in terms of human rights, but even in terms of things like this growth model, how much better they would have been if they'd never been held back in the first place by years of Maoism. The fact that it's not really the party that lifted people out of poverty, but, they did it themselves. They scrabbled and they paid for it in blood, sweat and tears, literally in many cases. But it's still important to recognize that people support the party for reasons that are not just to do with repression or propaganda. They're not just brainwashed, that they feel materially they have benefited from the party's rule.
It is interesting, isn't it? You can't understand China today without understanding the Cultural Revolution, but it's rarely mentioned. It's hidden away and so on.
Absolutely. And that was the extraordinary thing for me, the fact that it seemed to be both everywhere and nowhere in Chinese society. That I came to write this book really because you would be talking to somebody and it would very quickly become clear that you were once again sort of being taken back to the Cultural Revolution to really understand why they were the way they were, or why their life had worked out in the way they did. And that might be to do with sort of breakdown in family relationships, or it might be to do with film directors' sort of avant-garde work. Why did their work occur in that way? Well, because there'd been this sort of 10-year gap of outside influences and so forth. Or it might be, why did a tycoon become so successful? And they'd say, well, you know, the Cultural Revolution basically taught me you had to kind of scrabble and struggle and make it on your own and grasp every opportunity that you could. But none of these stories of modern China really made sense unless you understood the Cultural Revolution, and yet it was so rarely discussed publicly.
What do you think can be done now? I mean, we talked earlier about, you know, who is responsible? You know, can a 14-year-old young girl be held to account for what she did as a member of the Red Guard, for example? You know, you mentioned in the book how limited truth and reconciliation commissions can be. Is there anything that could be done, or indeed should anything be done now?
I think it's very hard to imagine something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission happening in modern China, for the obvious reasons that the party would just never allow the past, that particular part of the past, to be disinterred and picked over in that way. So that's clearly not going to happen while the party is in power, I would imagine. I think as well, it's quite easy for people to forget how painful something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa were. It all sounds kind of quite nice and rosy from a distance. Oh, great, everybody's sitting down. But, you know, there was a lot of, it was a harrowing experience for so many people. And many people, of course, will never be able to forgive, let alone forget what people did to their loved ones. But perhaps in time, you know, in the longer period, there may be some sort of reckoning. I think it's clear that while most young people don't know anything about it, there are people who are really interested. You know, a number of people who have said to me, I need to go and think more about this to try and talk to my parents. I want to know more now, or I want to understand this better. There are people who are interested. And I think there is hope as well to be found in the fact that people have sometimes managed to find a way to live together. I mean, one of my chapters concerns 3 people who were involved in the factional fighting in Chongqing as teenagers. And that was a place where it really became more like civil war. You know, people were fighting with tanks, with hand grenades because of the munitions factories, these Red Guards turning upon each other. And you now have 3 men in their later years in life who don't have much in common, and perhaps don't even like each other that much, and have completely different conclusions about what the Cultural Revolution was and about where China should go from here. One of them is a sort of completely unrepentant Maoist who basically thinks the Cultural Revolution shouldn't have ended. It all went terribly wrong. And then you've got someone else who'd like to see sort of a more liberal China. And then you've got someone else who would just wants the political status quo to stay exactly as it is. But somehow they have managed to find some way of rubbing along together, I suppose. That 2 of them are sort of supporting the neo-Maoist, the Maoist rather, sort of financially still. They're giving him support in his old age, that they managed to have discussions. They clearly disagree about a lot. It's not always a very harmonious relationship between them, but it is a relationship. After everything that happened, they're able to have this kind of connection with each other. And I think there is some sort of hope in that.
I mean, when you talk about contested histories. You know, you look at the debate on the British Empire currently, the history of the Cultural Revolution is buried and unlikely to emerge, which is why books like yours are so important, I feel. But without an honest reckoning, what impact will this have on China, I wonder? And one of the epigraphs to your book, intriguingly, is Xi quoting a scholar from the Qing dynasty who says, to destroy a country, you must first destroy its history. Well, what's the lesson here, do you think?
I think that we have to look to our pasts, and that we have to try as best we can to be honest. And obviously, we've just talked about how difficult memory is, and how partial it can be. But to try our best to have these discussions, to try our best to find ways to talk to each other. But I think it's also, for me, about being alert to the parallels, not only regarding history in our own society. And as you say, there are so many difficult discussions that have been had in Bristol as elsewhere, but also in looking at the kind of society that we are now. And one of the things that really struck me as I wrote were the parallels that seemed to be emerging, this deliberate fostering of divisions. I mean, what made the Cultural Revolution was not political zealotry, although people sometimes think that. It was the fact that you had power using mass emotion and mass zealotry. That was why it was so huge and so damaging. And we now live in an era where we're seeing in the UK, but also most obviously in the US with Trump, we've seen how politicians can kind of tap into the public ear, can whip up this emotion and really foster division. I mean, the divisions are so deliberate. Mao said, who are our enemies? Who are our friends? This is the most important question of the revolution. And it does feel as if that really has resonances to me, this idea that we have to find the enemy and draw a line between them.
And if you think about the growth of strong men leaders, you know, you can begin to see some of those parallels there as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And these attempts to sort of attack established political institutions that safeguard our democracy, but also the attempt to get people to turn upon each other, which I think is incredibly frightening. And we've obviously seen with some of the discussion going on now of illegal migration, of refugees being presented as scapegoats and these sort of dangerous figures who are coming over to sort of attack or overwhelm, I suppose, our way of life. It's incredibly disturbing.
So many lessons from history and warnings for today. Red Memory, Living, Remembering and Forgetting China's Cultural Revolution is out now from Faber. Thank you, Tania Branigan, for your book and for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.